Okay, so now, as Devi said, if anyone has questions for Phil to answer, we're happy to listen.
Thanks for putting me on the spot.
There's a question there.
So in your walk, all three of you, in this avenue, to what degree are we depleting these walks by kind of disconnecting from the miraculous when clearly the miraculous was both his calling and his manifestation of his little man?
In my experience, there are two kinds of people who love the autobiography of Yogi. The people who love it because of the miracles, and the people who love it despite the miracle. By which I mean, there are people for whom the miraculous stories, the stories of wonder and the great feats of the yogis he describes, is most appealing. And it's an eye-opener for them and an inspiration. Other people think it's poppycock, or, you know, just his imagination, or, you know, stories told to sort of wake people up, but that aren't necessarily true. But they love the book anyway. They get something else out of it. And that ambivalence is, it seems like ambivalence, but it's not. It's a paradox that the great teachers hold and teach very specifically and with purpose. Yogananda was one of them. So was Buddha. So were all the great masters. They would talk about the miraculous and the feats of consciousness as illustrations of what consciousness, human consciousness, is capable of when it's fully developed. And the stories have appeal because we love that kind of thing. We love to imagine having those powers, and we like knowing that they're possible. And they're door openers. And then the same teachers will say, but don't pay too much attention to that stuff. That's not what's important. What's important is your inner realization, your inner happiness, your inner peace. And if you get too caught up with the miraculous and aspire to that and aim for that, you're going to lose sight of what's really important. So they would present these and then ground you in what's really important. Yogananda was no different in that regard than some of the many, many teachers who, they'll say, yes, this stuff is possible, but like all the attractions of the world, you can go too far in being attached to them. And so use them. Don't try to cultivate them. If they happen to you, fine, use them for good purpose. If they don't, that's not the whole goal of spirituality. His teacher told him that. He had to be told that by his own guru and others, and he taught the same thing. The methods he taught, the meditative practices, what came to be called energization exercises, all these yogic methods, they had value. So forget about, you know, the great powers of the mind. It made people's lives better. They thought more clearly. They felt more calm inside. That's a miracle. That's miracle enough, isn't it?
Interesting.
I would add to that that I think you're being simplistic in dividing the world into believers and skeptics. I think there's a whole spectrum there. And so the real skeptics will get turned off by the miracles. They'll say, it's a charlatan, he's making it up, it isn't possible, throw that book away. But there's a gradation beyond that that asks, why should I believe him when everybody's putting out opinions or everybody's putting out teachings? Why should I follow along with this guy? Maybe I should actually follow some business teacher who is showing me how to make $1 million. So how do you know that that a person is authentic. And so the true skeptics don't even care whether he's authentic or not. They've already made up their mind that miracles aren't possible, therefore he has to be a fraud. The next group is saying, how do I know that he's not a fraud? And so to that group, talking about miracles opens up the, the space for them to listen to the real teaching, which is what Phil was saying. Swami Kriyananda used to say that he most liked to teach in India because you don't have to justify God or yourself. Secondly, he preferred Europe and especially Italy because they had a lot of heart quality. The hardest was speaking in America. He said, I had to spend the first half of the lecture convincing people that I wasn't a fraud. I had to spend the next quarter convincing people that I might know something about what I'm talking about that they don't already know. And I only had a quarter left to give any real teaching. And so it's like that with the autobiography and the miracles. You know, so the miracles convince people that he's not a fraud. And then he's got to unwind that for the real the people who want to go further, because at a certain point miracles become a barrier, not a lure.
They've answered it very well. Why don't we go on? Other questions?
Julie.
In your writing and research process, did you feel Yogananda guiding you, or did you develop a relationship with him as you immerse yourself in his life?
That's an interesting question. In American Veda, I wrote about all the gurus, and some of them, I may have spent a few days on, others more. And while I was writing about each of them, and about non-gurus, just influential people, I felt that I was establishing a relationship with them just because I was having to tune into who they were and the circumstances of their lives. But this was a few years of digging in and not only reading his own words, but reading about him and putting him in context. I've been on a spiritual path for about 50 years now, and I'm not prone to having spectacular experiences or paying too much attention to the esoteric. But there were times when I really did feel that. And especially times when it wasn't like, I hear Yogananda speaking to me. It wasn't, nothing like that. But there were times, especially when things were difficult, when I was sure I'd never meet my deadline, or I'd never get a handle on this chapter, or how to approach this aspect of his life. And when I was, tired and overwhelmed, there were those moments when I thought, something's guiding this. Maybe it's, the soul of Yogananda. Maybe it's just that I was tuned into, and it sounds pretentious, but tuned into something more important than me and this project and getting it done. But that there was something, of divinely inspired about needing to do it. And at those moments, I felt, this is probably my little minor league version of how Yogananda felt when he was facing difficulties and thought, I don't know how I can make this work. I just want to go back to India and be a monk. But he too felt the attunement to whatever is bigger, and maybe his guru's words, maybe the spirit of God, whatever it was, he persevered, and so I persevered. And those were the moments when I felt some kind of guidance, whether it's Yogananda or not. But I did come to feel like he was my friend. I came to, develop some kind of relationship with him in that sense, even though I've never been a disciple.
Are there, like, in Canada, do you get a chance to find out, like, where he grew up, and are there currently followers of, maybe not him because he left early, but, his gurus and their other disciples? Is there
Oh yeah, there's well, Jyotish and Devi spoke about their efforts in India. SRF has their, organization in India, and it's very active. I think, in fact, Yogananda's teachings are probably better known in India now than they were when he was alive. Certainly better than when he was alive, because he only lived 6 more years after Autobiography of a Yogi was published. And the autobiography, you could see it even in those 6 years. It expanded his reach in a significant way. Suddenly he was known in Europe. Suddenly, there were centers, in different parts of the country where they weren't before. There were students, globally, and that was just the beginning. So yes, and there's offshoots. His guru had other disciples as well, and so that lineage has branched off in many directions. And so Kriya Yoga is taught in different forms. Many teachers trace their lineage back to the same guru lineage. So yes, that's certainly the case in India.
It was fun. Last year we went to Calcutta and we went to visit Master's boyhood home at 4 Garpar Road. And our cab driver got lost, and so he was circling around, and then we were getting farther rather than closer. So one of the people in the car with us said, "Let's just get out. I know we can walk there. It's easier." So it was really fun. We were many blocks away from the home, and so we were walking, and it's kind of like a little neighborhood. If you grew up in Calcutta, it's lots of little neighborhoods. And so we were walking through the streets, and there were little children playing and people selling vegetables. And again, this is very subjective. I'm holding the leg of the elephant, not the whole picture. But it was like, wow, I felt like what I was thinking was, wow, Master, I'm in your neighborhood, and I just felt like I could feel him running down the streets playing and yelling to his friends, but his presence is more and more, he's being respected. In fact, the Prime Minister of India, Mahendra Modi, just issued a stamp from the National Indian Government for the 200-year anniversary of YSS. That's the Yogoda Satsanga Society that he founded. So it would be or it was last year, so 1917. That's when he founded it.
So the 100-year.
100-year anniversary, yes, thank you. But, and there's in Puri, there's Sri Yukteswar's ashram, Sarampur, Sri Yukteswar's ashram. Up in the Himalayas, you can go visit Babaji's cave. So, and the Hiri Mahashaya home in Benares. So there's many, many wonderful sites that you can go to visit throughout India. And so it's very rewarding.
I'll add to that. As part of my research, I went to those places. And then I've taken tour groups to India, and we trace the footsteps of all the gurus who came here, but with special emphasis on Yogananda now. In fact, I'm taking one soon. This is a commercial notice. There are postcards in the back for the next tour. But when you go not just to the home where he spent his teenage years, where his brother's grandson now lives and allows people to come and see the meditation room Yogananda as a teenager set aside for himself and that sort of thing. But you see the places that he went to visit some of the swamis and the mentors that he had early in his life, before he even met Sri Yukteswar. Some of those places are now ashrams and shrines. And if you go up the river, there's a Yogananda ashram along the Ganges, very close to the Kali temple where Sri Ramakrishna held forth. And Yogananda used to go there with one of his mentors and meditate long hours at that temple. And so you can retrace some of the footsteps. Like there's a center in Calcutta near the family home where, on the site where he created an ashram when he was 15 in a little sort of hut. So you can do those things and imagine that it's 100 years ago, before all the noise and the crowds and the automobiles.
Just to find a little factoid, a couple of years ago, Modi had an International Day of Yoga declared at the United Nations, and he chose as the icon for that day Yogananda. So that, you know, his reputation is growing and growing, and much more so after the autobiography, but also because India now is so westward looking that Yogananda is especially appealing to the current Indian mind, because he established himself in America and then his teachings are coming back.
And one final thought, which is fun. Ananda has a publishing house in India, and we now have autobiography in Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, so regional language. Tamil, yeah, that's right, 4 regional languages. So it enables a lot more people to read it as well. Question in the way back. Yes?
If you would each maybe tell a story of something that was new from the book that had meaning for you about your life.
Could you repeat?
I'll let them go first, because
Tell a story about something that was new in the book that was particularly meaningful. I don't know that a single story comes to mind, but an episode of his life, which was when he came first to America in 1920 and landed, and he was in Boston, and he started out living in a YMCA, and then it was about 4 years or 5 years that he was building a little group of people there in New York, in Boston, and he gradually began lecturing a little farther afield, but it was really not until about 1925, I think, that he gave his first lecture in New York, and you know,
24 actually.
24. And so that period of slow building, I guess, resonated with me particularly, or with us, because that's what we've been doing our whole lives. You know, we go into a new beachhead. It might be Europe, it might be India. We establish a little beachhead, and then gradually it builds and builds until it becomes a well-established enough work to touch many, many thousands of lives. So it just, to see that Yogananda went through that same process, and here's a great teacher, maybe it relaxed me a little bit about it. Maybe we're not such failures after we didn't walk into Carnegie Hall on the second day.
I think for me, particularly given the climate of intolerance in our country right now for diversity, reading about when Yogananda went to Miami, Florida, to give a talk, was that what, 28. He, you know, first he wrote to his friends that he was very enthusiastic. He really thought it was going to go well. And then there was a very, very redneck sheriff, or I guess head of the police department, was it? who just essentially ran Yogananda out of town on a rail, saying that it was just all sorts of charges, it was a sex cult and, all sorts of things. And this head of the police department, sometime shortly after that, was actually convicted of murder, so he was not a very savory character. But what I felt in reading that was that was a time, America, one likes to think we have become a more tolerant country, although sometimes one doubts it right now. But nevertheless, he lived through that at that time to just sort of, in a way, maybe bleed off some of the poison that other people of color would experience, and he took it onto himself. And it made me appreciate so much. He didn't have to come here. He could have been happy as a monk, but when Phil goes into a lot of detail about that episode, but it just was, wow. The great, you think, well, we can appreciate the martyrdom of many great saints in our Christian religion, but Yogananda was martyred in America as well, and it was, and how did he handle it? He just kept going. He just kept going. He did say that he felt those people would accrue very bad karma for treating a man of God that way. But anyway, that story was very powerful in my mind.
He called it his Miami crucifixion.
Yeah.
But I want to add to it. It wasn't just a bad apple of a police chief. The police chief was responding to what the newspapers called irate husbands, because Yogananda was making headway in Miami. He had a lot of students, the majority of whom, like today's yoga classes, were women. And he was not the first Swami to face that kind of thing. The dark-skinned heathen who has mind power could be hypnotizing the innocent American women to have their way with them. This was going on even before he arrived in America. There were hysterical things about the few swamis and yogis who were here for a while. So the racism, the fear, all that stuff entered into it, and he became a victim of it, and eventually was convinced by the lawyers he hired and well-meaning people that it would be a good idea to leave Miami before something really bad happens, and so he did. But it wasn't the only time he faced that sort of thing. And one of the things I enjoyed discovering, joy is not the word, but was the thrill of discovery, was that the British government was spying on him, essentially. He was the subject of the British Empire. He was traveling on a British passport as a subject of the British Raj in India, and he could have been deported at any time. And they were keeping an eye on him. I had access to internal memos from the British consulate and all that. I went to see him lecture. He seems innocent enough, but he might be on one of these Gandhi people, so keep an eye on him and that sort of thing. And the other aspect of that was, despite the sort of tenuous nature of his being here and the possibility of being sent away as an undesirable, this is during the freedom movement in India as it was getting bigger, and he spoke out. He was outspoken in his support of Gandhi and the freedom movement. And the other thing was, if you look at things he wrote and said throughout his time here, he was outspoken about a lot of current events. He was not a detached yogi in the sense we might imagine, that they see the world as all Maya, and we sort of stay away from the stuff of the newspaper headlines and all that, because that's all it's a distraction from your spiritual life. No, he was pretty engaged. He spoke out about things. He spoke out against you know, the greed and lack of concern for the destitute during the Depression. He spoke out about well, the greed of the 20s that led to the Depression as well. He spoke out in many ways against racism, against religious bigotry, and all kinds of things. He did not disengage in that way. And there's a lesson just in that about being an engaged yogi, but also that it took a good deal of courage for him, who, you know, could have, if he became an agitator, could easily have been sent back to India and the whole thing ended.
The distribution of your book, I really feel like it's going to be a huge bestseller. People are responding on social media in India, all over the world.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
In terms of distribution and the amount of books that you have, people in India, around the world have access through Amazon?
In India, because it hasn't been released yet in India. That's
well,
maybe they get it on Kindle. And
yeah, the social media. I have
great.
a lot of people that I'm friends with, and this week it's just exploded.
That's
Just
great
your
to hear.
Publications, your picture,
Well,
book on the site.
Maybe Oprah will hear of it.
I don't know whether Amazon ships books back and forth, but Amazon, as they call it in India, is extremely active among and growing. So
Yeah.
So a lot of people are ordering just as here. So if they have the books, I don't know whether they do or not.
All right, may I do something blatantly commercial?
Yes.
Okay, because you brought it up. If you find the book of value and you want other people to read it, all of you out there in live streaming land, write something nice on Amazon. I've just learned that really does matter. So please do, and get the book out there more.
Kind of like a random question, just the letter that Forrest Lawn issued about Yogananda's passing, about his body being uncorrupted and all this stuff. Did you touch on that, or did you address that in your book?
Yes, I comment on that. I try to, there's other controversies around Yogananda's life, and, especially if you go to the darker corners of the internet, there's all kinds of speculation and stuff, and I had to address all that. Did you all hear the question? It's about the famous page in the Autobiography where the letter from Forrest Lawn talks about the non-corruption of his body some weeks after his death. Here's what I said about it in a nutshell. There have been people who looked into that and found, sort of coroners and forensic experts who say it's not that unusual because he was embalmed and he was placed under glass for a while. So those observations were not that remarkable, and some people have said, well, there was more to the letter than what was printed in the book. I don't know the truth, and I don't care. My bottom line is, if Yogananda's body were disinterred today, 66 years after his death, and found to be pristine, or the opposite, it wouldn't matter. His teachings, his life as a human being in that incarnation wouldn't change. The teachings wouldn't be any less effective one way or the other, and that's what really matters to me. So I think too much is made of that, and too much is made of the counter-argument as well.
It comes back to the question of how far along that skeptic scale are you? Because if you're far enough along, what does it matter? His teachings are what he was really about.
I'll answer. I wanted to say this earlier, but I wanted to have people have more time for questions about miracles. There's a wonderful story from the life of the great Indian master Ramakrishna. That Phil mentioned, he has the great Dakshineshwar temple in Calcutta, outside of Calcutta. And his most famous disciple was Swami Vivekananda, who came to the West and he's written a number of kind of very influential books about yoga. So as a young man, Vivekananda went to his master Ramakrishna, and he said, "Master, I know you worship God in the form of the goddess Kali, and I know you have visions of her all the time. Will you bless me that I might have a vision of the goddess Kali?" And Ramakrishna kept saying, "You don't need it, you don't need it." But he kept bugging him. And so after a while, he said, "All right, tonight your wish shall be granted. Go home and meditate." So in his meditation, he just had this glorious vision of Divine Mother in the form of the goddess Kali. And it was just amazing, everything he wanted to perceive. And then the next morning he went to Ramakrishna, and Ramakrishna said, "So now what do you have?" Meaning, okay, this miracle happened, but if it doesn't change your consciousness, then it's just an event, whether it's super physical or not. So I think once someone said to Yogananda, "Your detractors are saying that you're losing your powers." And he said, "I don't know that I ever had any powers." So that's not what they value. You know, it's the change of consciousness in the people that come to them for help. And in a way, that's the greatest miracle of all, to transform, as they say, the dross of our consciousness, the mud of our consciousness, into the gold of God awareness. I've been at it for a lot of years, and that's a miracle.
There's a story like that in Yogananda's life. In fact, he writes about it in the Autobiography, and I sort of told it in a slightly different way in my book. There's a series of events, and then Sri Yukteswar, his guru, touches him a certain way, and he has this incredible vision. He writes about it, calls it a vision of cosmic consciousness. And it's a spectacular spiritual, sort of event. The kind of thing people read about and say, "I want that to happen to me." He has it, it's done, and Sri Yukteswar says, "Let's go sweep the balcony floor." And it's a very Zen-like story. Those are the kind of stories you hear about like a lot in the Zen tradition. Chop wood, carry water. Let's get back. Let's ground this in reality here, or what we call reality. Right.
Now, see, we're almost completely talking on a certain plane, but the real plane that Yogananda experienced is he ceased to be Yogananda. And so what miracle is happening to what or whom? Because at the stage of great samadhi, you merge with the infinite. And Yogananda had a statement, "I killed Yogananda long ago. No one dwells in this temple now but God." And so he has to play the part of a human being, and he played it beautifully, and it was a wonderful drama. But that's not necessarily where his consciousness is. It's a little like now we're seeing, video games and virtual reality. You may be playing the game in virtual reality or a video game, but that's not who you really are. But the difference is that he was aware of his beyondness, whereas we're still locked into the delusion that what you see is what you get.
I've read that Yogananda performed miracles, like we read about in the Bible, healing the sick, raising the dead. Did any of that come up? Because I've never read it anyplace else.
Yeah, there are stories about that, and I didn't hear anything about raising dead, but healing, yes, he clearly seems to have had great you know, his consciousness was, he had that power of consciousness that could do a lot of things, even when he was, you know, in his 20s and 30s, or even younger. There were stories about him as a teenager doing some remarkable things. And healing is one of them. But, you know, but it's very hard to know, you know, how reliable those stories are and how much of it gets embellished over time. But he spoke about it. In fact, at one point, he said he stopped doing it because people got enamored of it. They wanted the healing and didn't want to go any further spiritually.
You know, I just remembered it, the frontispiece of Autobiography of a Yogi, Master quotes the Bible saying, "Lest ye see signs and wonders, you will not believe." And so that may be why he talks about them. But as far as raising the dead, actually in Swami Kriyananda's autobiography, The New Path, he talks about an incident where there was, I believe, he was an insurance salesman. I just remember that part of it. And his wife was critically ill, and he kept asking Master if he would have, you know, heal his wife, heal. And Master had said, "I only do what God tells me to do. I have no power on my own." And then finally the man's wife died. And Master said, "Now God tells me to go." And he did raise her from the dead. So that's in Swami's autobiography, The New Path.
But we can accept that. Phil has to go and find the source and verify that.
They're no longer alive.
But there are
No, those are the times when you say, "And Swami Kriyananda said."
right.
Say, "I'm off the hook."
Yeah. We know Swami. He spent years in India, and he met and was with many of the people who knew Yogananda. So he has his own independent source of stories, and we know him to be completely honest. So when he says that that story is true, we don't need any more. But Phil writing for the public is what I was referring to.
That's a question.
I was curious where your information for the biography tended to come from, different places.
My sources, you mean?
Yeah.
There's his own writing, not just the autobiography, but, you know, his disciples were very meticulous about recording everything, all of his speeches, all of his conversations. And he wrote a lot of essays and articles for their in-house magazine, you know, that he started in the 20s and continued. People wrote about him, as we were saying. You know, Swami Kriyananda wrote about him. Some of his other direct American disciples wrote about him. His brother, his younger brother, wrote a memoir called Mejda, which is what they called him, about their boyhood together. One of his spiritual companions as a teenager also went on to become a Swami, and they were kind of spiritual colleagues. He wrote about their time together as young men. And there were government documents. There were letters that are unpublished that I managed to get my hands on. There were letters that were published by SRF and others, you know, that put them together. Yogananda is so, there's so many people enamored of Yogananda that some of them became collectors of Yogananda-bilia, you could say. and some for benign purposes, just because, you know, he was their guru and they wanted to collect everything they could, and others for not benign purposes. They wanted to get the dirt on him and so forth. And I managed to get some private archives as well. So it was a combination of all those things. I interviewed people in India, I interviewed people here. Of course, he's been gone too long to have, you know, interviewed many direct disciples who knew him. And by the time I got around to writing this book, I had met and interviewed Swami Kriyananda, but I wasn't writing this book at that time. But there were one or two that I did. So, you know, you just do whatever you can. And there are little things like when he returned from India, I just love this story. When he returned from India, he'd been away 16 months. And the last leg of the journey was a ship from the UK to New York. He was delayed in New York for 3 or 4 days. They wouldn't let him back into the country. And this was known because people have seen the records of, you know, the documents that say, you know, here's a list of the people on ship. These people were detained, and you know, all this stuff. And there was all kinds of speculation on the internet about why he was detained. And all, you know, there were, you know, scurrilous things hypothesized. And I didn't know the answer. But I managed to get in touch with the National Archives, and they have an immigration department and all that. And so one of the historians dug into it for me. Because the forms I saw had all these symbols on it, and I didn't know how to decipher the symbols. And it turns out, out of all these really dramatic and sensational explanations that had been offered, that people were absolutely convinced were true. Everything from, you know, he was held up because he was considered a radical, you know, Gandhiite, and, you know, there was a lawsuit pending and they wouldn't let him in until. Turns out that there were 2 theories. One, he was traveling under Mukundalal Ghosh, his real name, and as Swami Yogananda, and they needed to straighten out who he was. The main reason, the historian said, was if you look at this date and this document, his re-entry visa had expired. And I noticed, yeah, right, there's these letters that say, I'm staying in India longer, I have to renew my re-entry visa in order to do it. And then he decides to stay even longer, and so it expired before he got here. And that was it. But you think about it, if I hadn't done that, you know, maybe one of the other theories would have prevailed. And, you know, rumors spread. But that's, you know, the nature of reality these days.
I thought you were going to say...
There's your elephant story.
I thought you were going to say he had a piece of fruit that he got on board the ship.
The metal alarm went off.
Maybe one last question.
I have a follow-up question to that. Did you research in the National Archives in India sources in Bengali or Hindi? Were you able to find any like local sources that you had to translate or anything like that?
I had to get some letters that he wrote in Bengali translated for me. But they were, you know, private letters between him and Bengali friends. But I didn't do much of that in India. I spoke to people in India who were sort of expert in the life of the family, the history of Calcutta, you know, had looked into his early life and that sort of thing. But I didn't go into the Bengali archives or anything like that.
Are those background papers available for the rest of us?
Are what?
The background
have you
papers.
compiled all that information so the rest of us can consult them as well?
You're welcome to come look in my file drawers.
So maybe we'll let people buy Phil's book and he can
Yeah,
sign it. But, you know, I want to just have a final few words that I just think beyond any commercial motivation, I think this book is a great contribution to the world of spiritual understanding. And I think we just all owe Phil a great debt of gratitude for the effort and the wonderful job he's done.
I must add that I greatly appreciate the support that Jyotish and Devi have given me from the start, not only in cooperating and give me access to other people in the Ananda world who were very helpful in my research and my outreach, and now in the promotion phase. I value them as friends, and as their support is very meaningful to me. And so I give them, please.
Thank you all so very much. Before we have the book signing, we wanted to end with a chant of Yogananda Ji's that Keshava was going to share on cello.
For those of you who don't know it, Keshava is a second generation Ananda, born at Ananda, grew up at Ananda, and learned his cello there.
It's true. And I invite you to close your eyes and try to absorb the vibration of this chant and try to feel for Yogananda's spirit behind every note.